Picture this: Berlin, 1940. Hitler sits at a grand table, maps sprawling across the surface, generals saluting at every word. He chuckles, a smug, guttural laugh, at reports of America's factories. Ford, General Motors. These are toys for consumers. Radios, refrigerators, automobiles, soft luxuries for weak Democrats. They cannot fight a real war. Now cut across the Atlantic. Michigan. The River Rouge plant in Detroit awakens before dawn. Sirens wail, not air raid alarms, but factory whistles. Thousands of men and women pour through gates, lunch pails in hand. Sparks fly, steel bends, riveters hammer, and out of this industrial symphony rises something far from a toy: a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. By 1944, one rolls off the line every 63 minutes. Imagine Hitler's smirk if he could see it. While he lectured about Germany's invincible industry, the United States was turning assembly lines into weapons of mass production. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred, but 18,000 B-24s in total, more than any other American bomber of the war. Ford's Willow Run plant became the cathedral of this new faith, worship not of ideology, but of rivets, gears, and relentless repetition. The irony bites deep. Germany prided itself on precision craftsmanship, building weapons like luxury watches, exquisite, but slow, fragile, and scarce. America built weapons like kitchen appliances, durable, ugly, reliable, and churned out by the tens of thousands. Which mattered more in modern war, the perfect Messerschmitt, or a sky so black with liberators that sunlight vanished? And those skies mattered. Over Europe, the B-24 became a hammer of attrition. From Ploiești's oil fields to the Ruhr's factories, from submarine pens in France to troop convoys in Italy, the Liberator rained destruction with industrial rhythm. Not elegant dogfights, not singular wonder weapons, but squadrons, hundreds of bombers moving as one, blotting out the horizon. Each wave screamed a message Hitler never wanted to hear: you cannot outlaugh a production line. This is the story of arrogance undone by assembly lines. A dictator who sneered at mass production, and a democracy that turned car factories into engines of annihilation. It is about the transformation of American industry into an army of machines, and how that army swept across continents without ever marching a step. Stay with me. In this episode, we'll dive deep into how Ford retooled consumer industry into military supremacy, how the B-24 became a flying symbol of Detroit's might, and how Germany's obsession with perfection left it gasping under waves of good-enough bombers. If you want more untold stories where history mocks arrogance and celebrates ingenuity, hit subscribe, share this video, and keep the conversation alive. Because history has a sense of irony, and sometimes the loudest laughter comes from factories running day and night. In the early 1940s, Adolf Hitler and his entourage of generals clung to a comfortable illusion that America was a land of weak consumers, incapable of real war. From his wolf's lair, he dismissed reports of U.S. industrial capacity with a sneer. To him, the nation of jukeboxes, Coca-Cola, and assembly line automobiles could not possibly match the disciplined craft of the Reich. Germany, after all, had engineers who designed the V-2 rocket and the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. America had Henry Ford selling cars to farmers. To Hitler, the comparison was a joke, and he was laughing. But history has a cruel taste for irony. While the Führer chuckled at assembly lines, those very lines were mutating into something monstrous. The same machinery that once produced sedans and refrigerators was being retooled into a war machine. By the time Hitler's laughter echoed through Berlin's bunkers, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was already spitting out B-24 Liberator bombers with the predictability of a clock. Every 63 minutes, another four-engined behemoth rolled off the line. The Reich might produce a few dozen advanced aircraft in a month. America was producing a strategic air force before lunch. The contrast was grotesque. Germany built weapons like jewelers, intricate, polished, handcrafted by limited specialists. Each Messerschmitt carried the pride of craftsmanship, but also the curse of scarcity. Meanwhile, America built weapons like bakers churning out loaves of bread, simple, uniform, endless. The question was never whether a bomber was beautiful, but whether the skies could be filled until daylight vanished behind wings and propellers. Of course, Hitler was not alone in his miscalculation. Many in Europe clung to the belief that the United States, still recovering from the Great Depression, lacked the will or the means to mobilize. Germany's spies assured him, American factories were for toys, not tanks. The Führer lapped up these reports, adding his own disdain. In one infamous moment, he scoffed that America could produce refrigerators, not fighters. The irony! Those refrigerator factories soon turned to building engine parts for bombers that would incinerate German cities. This blind arrogance had consequences. Germany invested heavily in wonder weapons, technological marvels that looked revolutionary but arrived too late and too few to change the war's trajectory. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, each dazzled, but none arrived in numbers large enough to break the Allies. The Reich treated war like a boutique showcase, as if quality could compensate for quantity. America treated war like a supermarket: flood the shelves, overwhelm the buyer, and let numbers decide. And the numbers were merciless. By 1944, U.S. factories turned out not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of aircraft every month. The B-24 Liberator became the most produced heavy bomber in history, with more than 18,000 built. Willow Run alone, once mocked as Ford's folly, delivered nearly 9,000 of them. Hitler could laugh at Ford all he wanted, but by the time the Allies' bombing campaign reached its crescendo, the laugh was drowned out by the drone of liberators blotting out the sky over the Ruhr. The joke, then, was not on America, it was on Germany. Hitler's contempt for industrial democracy blinded him to its true strength. Factories filled with ordinary workers, many of them women, became the arsenal of democracy. The Reich had slave labor in underground tunnels. America had volunteers with paychecks and lunch breaks. One side forged weapons in misery, the other in overtime. Guess which proved more sustainable? By the summer of 1944, as B-24 formations leveled oil refineries, submarine pens, and rail yards, even hardened Wehrmacht officers began to see the imbalance. They could marvel at the elegance of a jet fighter, but it was hard to ignore the industrial storm that sent hundreds of bombers over their heads every week. Germany's obsession with precision had birthed marvels. America's obsession with production had birthed victory. The irony deepens when we consider that Hitler fancied himself a student of history. He knew of the First World War, of America's late entry tipping the scales. Yet in his hubris, he believed lightning would not strike twice. He underestimated Roosevelt's call for an arsenal of democracy. He underestimated Henry Ford's capacity to turn car plants into bomber plants. He underestimated, fatally, the power of a stopwatch, one bomber every 63 minutes. So the stage was set: on one side, a dictator intoxicated with his own superiority; on the other, a democracy that weaponized its consumer culture. The outcome was never really in doubt. Laughter may be loud, but it cannot drown out 18,000 bombers. At the heart of this story lies a brutal contrast. Germany worshipped precision, while America worshipped production. Hitler's laughter at U.S. industry was not just arrogance, it was blindness. The B-24 Liberator, rolling off assembly lines faster than a German engineer could sharpen his pencil, embodied the reality that in modern war, mass beats mastery. The question was never whose machines were prettier, but whose machines were more numerous. To understand why Ford's Willow Run plant mattered, we must step inside it. Imagine not a workshop, but a continent under one roof. The factory sprawled over 3.5 million square feet, so vast that workers joked you could get lost inside for days. Conveyors snaked across hangar-like halls, delivering aluminum ribs, engine blocks, and miles of wiring. Each station performed a sliver of the task, and by the time the fuselage reached the end, it had been touched by thousands of hands. This was not craftsmanship, it was choreography. Unlike German production, where skilled artisans painstakingly shaped parts, Willow Run turned bombers into products of synchronized motion. Henry Ford's genius was not aviation, it was the assembly line. The same logic that once made the Model T affordable now made strategic bombing inevitable. The scale defies belief. At peak output, Willow Run employed more than 40,000 workers, many of them women, some commuting for hours each day. By 1944, one B-24 rolled out every 63 minutes. Let's pause here. Imagine a German engineer polishing the canopy of a Me-262, carefully fitting parts by hand. In that same hour, across the Atlantic, a new Liberator taxied out, engines roaring, destined to join an armada. The numbers told the story better than propaganda ever could. Germany produced around 1,400 Me-262 jets total during the war. America produced 18,000 B-24s, 13 times as many of a single bomber type. Even if every German jet had flown flawlessly, they would still have been swamped by sheer volume. War is not a duel of prototypes, it is a contest of multiplication. And the B-24 itself was designed for multiplication. Though criticized by pilots for being less forgiving than the B-17 Flying Fortress, it was faster, had longer range, and could carry heavier bomb loads. It was not about romance, it was about efficiency. The B-17 may have been beloved, but the B-24 was indispensable, especially for missions that demanded endurance. Ford built them with ruthless pragmatism. No artistry, no ornament, just payload capacity and production speed. Here's where the satire sharpens. Hitler dreamed of wonder weapons, rockets to terrify, jets to dazzle. But war is not an exhibition hall. What use is a jet fighter that arrives in dribbles, when your cities are flattened daily by squadrons of bombers? Germany's boutique approach produced marvels but missed the point. America's supermarket approach delivered results, ugly, relentless, devastating. Let's picture a single raid. A formation of 700 B-24s takes off, stretching across the sky like a steel migration. Each aircraft carries 8,000 pounds of bombs. That is 5.6 million pounds of explosives in one wave. Germany could produce a few dozen V-2 rockets with similar destructive yield, but the Allies could deliver it every week, sometimes every day. Which would you rather have, a handful of rockets or a river of fire from the clouds? It was not just Ford. The U.S. harnessed its entire industrial ecosystem. General Motors produced engines, Goodyear manufactured tires, Douglas assembled wings, while small machine shops fabricated rivets by the billions. This decentralized but coordinated model baffled German observers. They could not imagine a society where so many separate firms worked in concert. For the Reich, industry was centralized and controlled. For America, it was competitive but united by necessity. That difference proved decisive. Even labor demographics told the story. While Germany chained prisoners in tunnels, America invited Rosie the Riveter into the daylight of factories. The Reich relied on fear, the U.S. relied on overtime pay. Which workforce lasted longer? Which worked with pride? In the clash between forced labor and volunteer industry, the latter proved far more productive. The result was not just numbers, but momentum. Once Willow Run perfected its rhythm, the flow became unstoppable. Raw materials entered at one end, ore, rubber, aluminum, and flying fortresses exited at the other. The plant was nicknamed the bomber conveyor belt. For Hitler, who had once mocked Ford's obsession with efficiency, this was a cruel punchline. The man he laughed at had built the machine that would bury him. The B-24 was not a perfect airplane. Pilots cursed its Davis wing, which made takeoffs and landings a hair-raising ordeal. Its bomb bay doors, designed like rolling curtains, could jam. Crews nicknamed it the flying coffin. Yet none of that mattered when viewed from an industrial lens. Perfection was irrelevant. Quantity was king. The Liberator's flaws were drowned beneath an avalanche of production. If one failed, another was already on the runway. Compare that to German bombers like the Heinkel He-177, an aircraft so over-engineered it set itself on fire. Built in small numbers, each carried the weight of unrealistic expectations. America's B-24s, by contrast, were designed to be expendable. The war effort did not rely on any single bomber surviving. It relied on enough bombers flying to guarantee destruction. It was statistical warfare, fought with spreadsheets as much as with bomb sights. Let's look at range. The B-24 could fly nearly 2,100 miles, about 500 miles farther than the B-17. This made it invaluable in the Pacific, where vast distances separated islands. In Europe, it meant striking deep into Germany, hitting targets once considered unreachable. Willow Run did not just build bombers, it extended Allied reach across continents. Imagine Hitler tracing circles on his maps, calculating safe zones beyond British bombers, only to watch the Liberator erase those zones overnight. And payload. Each B-24 could haul up to 8,800 pounds of bombs. A squadron of 50 aircraft carried nearly 500,000 pounds, more than the entire monthly output of Germany's V-1 rocket program in destructive power. America treated destruction as a bulk commodity, measured in tons per hour, not prototypes per year. It was Walmart versus a boutique jeweler, and in total war, bulk always wins. The industrial logic reached absurd, almost comic levels. At one point, Willow Run's efficiency was so high that Ford executives bragged the plant could produce an entire bomber in the time it took Germany to brew a keg of beer. Hyperbole, perhaps. But when you see Liberators rolling down the line like sausages, the metaphor is hard to resist. Even logistics turned into a weapon. Ford's supply chain stretched across the nation, aluminum from Pennsylvania, rubber from Akron, engines from Detroit. Trains delivered parts with machine-like punctuality, feeding Willow Run's endless appetite. This network was itself a battlefield. While German trains were bombed, rerouted, and crippled, American railroads ran uninterrupted, delivering the sinews of war. Hitler may have had panzers, but Roosevelt had freight schedules. The beauty of the American system was its redundancy. If one plant faltered, another picked up the slack. Consolidated Aircraft, Douglas, and North American all contributed to B-24 production. By war's end, 5 different assembly lines had churned them out. Germany, in contrast, clung to centralized facilities vulnerable to bombing. When the Allies struck Peenemünde, rocket production staggered. When they struck Willow Run, production hardly blinked, because Willow Run could not be replicated, it had already been multiplied. Here lies the bitterest irony for Hitler. He believed democracy was weak because it tolerated disorder, debate, and competition. But that very decentralization created resilience. American firms competed for contracts, innovated independently, and shared breakthroughs across industries. Germany's centralized control stifled creativity, bottlenecked resources, and ensured that setbacks became catastrophes. The Reich prized control, the U.S. thrived on chaos. And in war, adaptive chaos proved stronger than rigid order. From a technical perspective, the B-24 was not glamorous. It lacked the romance of the Spitfire or the menace of the Stuka. But it was a workhorse, a machine designed for no other purpose than to deliver explosives until the enemy's capacity to resist collapsed. In that sense, it symbolized the American war effort, not elegant, not ideological, but relentless. By 1945, the statistics read like a death sentence for Hitler's arrogance. Nearly 1.4 million tons of bombs were dropped on Germany by the U.S. 8th Air Force alone, much of it delivered by B-24s. Industrial regions burned, fuel reserves dried up, transportation networks shattered. Factories that once built Messerschmitts stood silent, their roofs torn open by waves of Liberators. Germany was not outthought, it was outproduced. So when we speak of the B-24 every 63 minutes, it is more than a number. It is the embodiment of a strategy. Win by making war a factory process. Reduce destruction to intervals, synchronize it with shifts, and let the clock do the killing. While Hitler laughed at refrigerators, America weaponized refrigerators' factories. The dictator mistook laughter for strength. History mistook efficiency for destiny. Let us begin in the Balkans, August 1943, Operation Tidal Wave. The target, Ploiești, Romania, the beating heart of Hitler's oil supply. 4 years, German tanks and aircraft drank fuel from these refineries. Hitler boasted they were untouchable, shielded by flak and geography. Then came the Liberators. B-24s roared in at treetop level, hundreds of them, flying so low that oil workers swore they could see the whites of American eyes. Each bomber carried thousands of pounds of explosives, and when the formation reached the refineries, the sky itself ignited. Smoke rose in columns that blotted the sun. Hitler's lifeline went up in flames. True, the mission was costly, 53 bombers lost in a single raid, but the symbolism was devastating. The Reich had believed in invulnerability. The Liberator proved that even untouchable targets could be hammered when you had enough steel and enough factories to replace the losses. It was the same story repeated across Europe. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial crown jewel, became a testing ground for American persistence. Liberators swept over the factories of Essen, Dortmund, and Dusseldorf with industrial rhythm. Every raid was another chapter in a relentless ledger. 500 bombers today, 700 tomorrow, each carrying tons of explosives. German workers repaired by day, liberators unrepaired by night. The rhythm was mechanical, merciless, like an assembly line in reverse, factories undone by factories. And the irony: German engineers toiled over the V-2 rocket, an engineering marvel that consumed astronomical resources to deliver a single warhead. Meanwhile, a single wave of B-24s delivered more destruction in one afternoon than the entire V-weapon program managed in weeks. Hitler's wonder weapons were jewels. America's bombers were bulldozers. The battlefield does not award points for elegance. Take the submarine pens along the French coast. Germany invested heavily in U-boat warfare, hoping to starve Britain into submission. The pens were armored fortresses, reinforced with meters of concrete. Hitler declared them impregnable. And perhaps against conventional bombing, they were. But not against squadrons of liberators returning again and again, each time dropping thousands of pounds of high explosives. Cracks widened, roofs buckled, supply lines fractured. The pens became tombs for submarines still under construction. Hitler could mock American consumerism all he wanted, but in the end, the consumer society buried his submarines before they ever touched water. Italy, too, felt the Liberator's reach. When the Allies invaded in 1943, B-24s flew deep into the peninsula, cutting railways, smashing supply depots, and isolating German divisions. What the Wehrmacht called strategic redeployment soon turned into strategic paralysis. Roads clogged with wreckage, bridges disappeared into rivers, and soldiers marched under skies buzzing with bombers. Every movement became a gamble. German generals muttered about Allied air supremacy. In truth, it was less supremacy and more saturation. Hitler had laughed at Ford's factories. Now his generals trembled at their products. Perhaps the most brutal demonstration of the B-24's power came in late 1944, when American strategic bombing turned its attention to oil once again, this time in Germany proper. Synthetic fuel plants in Luna, Merseburg, and elsewhere became recurring targets. Day after day, squadrons of liberators obliterated production. By autumn, German fuel reserves had dwindled to a fraction of what they once were. Tanks sat idle. Jets, the pride of German innovation, were grounded for lack of fuel. The Reich had built engines faster than it could feed them. And all because a factory in Michigan, which once made cars, now made bombers every 63 minutes. It is tempting to imagine Hitler in his bunker, still chuckling at American consumer toys, even as his armies ran out of gasoline and his cities glowed with the fires of strategic bombing. Did he ever realize the cruel joke? That the nation he dismissed as weak had weaponized abundance? That refrigerators, typewriters, and cars had been reforged into a tidal wave of steel wings? The case of the B-24 is not about tactical brilliance. It is about blunt force, delivered with industrial regularity. It was not the sharp rapier strike of a jet fighter. It was the hammer blow of 1,000 tons of steel, repeated until the anvil cracked. That was the genius of Ford's production. Not the individual machine, but the swarm, the certainty, the inevitability. Spring 1944, France was a fortress, or so Hitler believed. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees, bristling with bunkers, coastal guns, and minefields. The Führer reassured himself that no army could breach it. Yet, he seemed to forget one inconvenient truth. walls mean little when the roof collapses. And the roof of Hitler's fortress was the sky. Enter the Liberators. In the months before D-Day, B-24 squadrons pounded northern France with mechanical regularity. Bridges, marshalling yards, fuel depots, nothing survived the industrial hailstorm. Hitler might have boasted of Festung Europa, but what good is a fortress when the supply lines that feed it are ripped apart daily? The Wehrmacht expected to repel soldiers on beaches. Instead, they fought ghosts in the sky. Consider the French railway system. By early 1944, it was the lifeline for German troops and armor rushing to Normandy. The U.S. 8th Air Force turned that lifeline into rubble. B-24s did not just destroy trains, they erased the rails themselves. Locomotives lay overturned like children's toys, tracks twisted into grotesque sculptures of steel. Every raid delayed reinforcements. Every bomb widened the gap between Hitler's plans and reality. And what of the German Luftwaffe? By 1944, it was less a shield than a rumor. Once, Hitler had bragged of air superiority. Now his fighters were too few, his pilots too inexperienced, his fuel tanks too empty. Against swarms of liberators, German defenses became tragic pantomime. A handful of fighters would scramble, score a kill or two, and then vanish into the overwhelming tide. It was a duel of mosquitoes against hurricanes. On June 6, 1944, when Allied troops stormed the beaches, they did so under a sky already pacified by months of relentless bombing. The German response was chaotic because their communications and infrastructure had been shredded. Tanks that might have crushed the invasion never reached the front in time. Artillery was isolated. Soldiers marched on foot, harassed from above by formations of B-24s. The Wehrmacht fought bravely, but bravery cannot fill a fuel tank or rebuild a bridge. Hitler had once dismissed America as a nation of dollar merchants. Yet on D-Day, it was those merchants' factories that decided the battle. For every German tank hidden in hedgerows, dozens of liberators were overhead, scattering bombs with clinical repetition. The invasion was not won solely on the beaches, it was prepared and secured by the skies. The B-24 was not the poster child of that day, but it was the unseen giant, grinding the German war machine into immobility. And still, Hitler mocked. In speeches, he insisted that Allied bombing was ineffective, that German morale remained unbroken. But denial is not defense. Cities burned, factories stood silent, and yet the Führer kept boasting of miracle weapons. One wonders if he even realized how absurd he sounded. While American factories rolled out another bomber every 63 minutes, Hitler promised that one rocket here, one jet there, would reverse the tide. It was a delusion bordering on parody. By late summer 1944, as Allied troops liberated Paris, the evidence was undeniable. B-24s had turned northern France into a logistical graveyard. Roads cratered, depots flattened, fuel scarce. German commanders wrote grim reports about the impossibility of moving reinforcements under constant bombardment. Some compared the experience to fighting with one arm tied behind their back. Others quietly admitted it was like fighting without arms at all. The Liberator was not a glamorous weapon. It did not inspire awe like the V-2 rocket or the Me-262 jet. But glamour does not win wars, availability does. And the availability of B-24s was overwhelming. Germany, for all its brilliance, could not match the brute fact that Ford's assembly lines worked harder, faster, and longer than any wonder weapon laboratory. The Reich gambled on quality, the Allies invested in quantity. The invasion of France proved which wager was correct. So as the Allies surged across Normandy and into the French countryside, one lesson was written in smoke across the sky. Hitler's laughter at American industry was the hollowest sound of the war. His armies did not collapse because they were outthought or outfought. They collapsed because they were outproduced, crushed beneath a sky filled with steel made in Detroit. By late 1944, the Reich was bleeding fuel. The Wehrmacht's tanks, trucks, and aircraft had once thundered across Europe with terrifying speed. Now they sputtered and stalled, running on fumes.
Why?
Because the liberators had declared war not on soldiers, but on gasoline. Synthetic oil plants at Luna, Merseburg, Bolin, and Ploiești became the favorite victims of B-24 formations. Day after day, hundreds of bombers droned overhead, dropping their payloads with grim consistency. These were not glamorous missions. There were no dramatic dogfights, no ace pilots claiming personal glory. It was industrial extermination, factories flattened, pipelines severed, refineries reduced to smoldering craters. The results were immediate and catastrophic. By the autumn of 1944, German aviation fuel production had collapsed by more than 80%. Luftwaffe squadrons grounded their aircraft not because of lack of planes, but because their tanks were dry. Imagine the absurdity. Hitler bragged of miracle jets, sleek and lethal, yet most never left the runway because the Reich had no kerosene to feed them. The Allies had not just clipped Germany's wings, they had drained its veins. And here lies the cruelest irony. While German scientists toiled in underground labs, handcrafting engines for futuristic weapons, Ford's Willow Run plant continued to churn out B-24s with the monotonous rhythm of a metronome. Every 63 minutes, another bomber emerged to ensure that whatever Germany built would never fly, never drive, never reach the front. Precision craftsmanship could not compete with hourly inevitability. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Hitler's last gamble, exposed the scale of the disaster. Panzer divisions rolled west in a desperate attempt to split the Allies. At first, they advanced, fueled by stockpiles scraped together for this one final throw of the dice. But within days, their momentum faltered. Fuel trucks were empty, depots abandoned, vehicles immobilized. When Allied bombers, including swarms of Liberators, returned to the skies after the fog lifted, they pounded bridges and fuel points, sealing the Wehrmacht's fate. Germany's tanks were not destroyed in glorious battle. They were left stranded in forests, monuments to logistical collapse. Consider the numbers. A single B-24 could carry nearly 4 tons of bombs. A formation of 500 aircraft, common by late 1944, delivered 2,000 tons in one mission. Germany's entire monthly synthetic fuel output by November 1944 was less than what those bombs could obliterate in a single raid. It was as if every hour of Willow Run's production translated directly into another nail in the coffin of Hitler's armies. The effect rippled across every front. In Italy, German forces abandoned vehicles for lack of petrol. In the east, supplies intended for the Red Army's front were diverted to plug gaps left by bombing damage in the west. The Reich's war machine, once famed for blitzkrieg, had slowed to a crawl. Blitzkrieg without fuel is just Krieg. The psychological impact was equally severe. Wehrmacht officers wrote bitter reports about the impossibility of maneuvering under constant bombing. Soldiers joked grimly that their new insignia should be a fuel can. Hitler, predictably, dismissed these concerns, insisting that miracle weapons would soon restore balance. But a miracle weapon cannot run on prayers. It requires octane. And octane was precisely what the Liberators had stolen. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the rhythm of production never faltered. Workers in Michigan and California, many of them women balancing families with factory shifts, kept feeding the conveyor belt of war. They may not have known the names of Luna or Merseburg, but their fingerprints were on every bomb that fell there. The Reich had slave laborers digging tunnels in misery. America had Rosie the Riveter tightening bolts to victory. The contrast could not have been starker. By early 1945, Germany's fuel reserves were virtually gone. Hitler's armies fought with dwindling resources, cannibalizing equipment, rationing ammunition, and abandoning entire formations. The once feared Luftwaffe became a ghost, its silence over German skies speaking louder than propaganda broadcasts. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March, the opposition was feeble not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked gasoline. And so, in a final irony worthy of satire, Hitler's laughter at American industry had come full circle. He had once scoffed at Ford's assembly lines. Yet it was those assembly lines that built the machines that destroyed his oil fields, starved his armies, and left his wonder weapons to rust. What is a jet without fuel? What is a panzer without petrol? They are nothing more than statues on a battlefield, monuments to arrogance. By 1945, The Reich was a shell of its former self. The once proud cities of Germany, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, had become names synonymous with firestorms. And though the B-17 often stole the headlines, the B-24 Liberator was just as present, just as relentless, a workhorse in the great unmaking of Hitler's empire. Factories that had once produced tanks and aircraft were now skeletal ruins. Bridges collapsed into rivers, railways splintered into twisted heaps of metal. Every artery of German logistics throbbed with pain, cut again and again by Liberator raids. The Reich was dying not with a single decisive blow, but with thousands of cuts delivered from the sky. Consider Berlin itself. By early 1945, the capital had become a target too symbolic to ignore. Waves of liberators joined other Allied bombers in raids that reduced whole districts to rubble. Hitler still raged in his bunker, mocking American production as soulless, even as the ground above him trembled with each detonation. Soulless or not, those bombs were rewriting the map. The B-24s did not discriminate between military and industrial targets. They hit both with equal consistency. Ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, once considered vital for the Wehrmacht, were reduced to smoking craters. Rail hubs in Hanover and Kassel ceased to function. Even smaller towns became victims, their factories erased because they dared to produce parts for Hitler's war machine. Germany's celebrated engineering marvels never had a chance. They were suffocated before they could breathe. And yet, amid the destruction, the satire writes itself. Hitler had mocked American consumerism, scoffing that a nation of assembly lines and dollar signs could not compete with German genius. But in the end, it was precisely those assembly lines that proved decisive. Ford's Willow Run had built bombers with the same logic it once built Model Ts. Germany built wonders, America built inevitability. Picture the scene, a formation of 800 B-24s flying over the Ruhr in February 1945. Their engines roar like an endless thunderstorm. On the ground, anti-aircraft crews fire desperately, but the sky is simply too full. Bombs fall in sheets, flattening everything from steelworks to power plants. For the defenders, it is like trying to stop the tide with a bucket. For Hitler, it is the ultimate punchline. He had promised the German people invincible weapons, yet here they were, hiding in basements, praying as American industry rained from the clouds. The psychological collapse was as devastating as the physical. German civilians, once reassured by propaganda, now whispered bitter jokes. Our wonder weapon is waiting for fuel. Our miracle jet cannot take off. Each raid by B-24s deepened the sense of futility. Even Wehrmacht officers admitted privately that the war was lost. They could see it in the empty fuel tanks, in the paralyzed trains, in the endless bombers overhead. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Allied troops crossed from the west, the Liberator's job was nearly done. German skies belonged entirely to the Allies. The once mighty Luftwaffe barely existed. The last B-24 raid struck at the remnants of an economy already in ashes. In truth, the bombers were less destroying Germany than ensuring it stayed destroyed. And still, in his bunker, Hitler clung to delusion. He spoke of secret weapons, of reversal, of destiny. But what destiny can survive an assembly line producing bombers faster than you can invent excuses? His laughter at American industry had long since turned hollow. The Reich's downfall was not written in ideology or even in battle tactics. It was written in production schedules, in shift rotations, in the monotony of rivets and bolts. So when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Liberator stood as one of the quiet victors. It was not as famous as the atomic bomb, not as sleek as the Mustang fighter, not as beloved as the Spitfire. But it had been relentless, tireless, the steel cloud that darkened Hitler's skies until no laughter remained. The irony could not be sharper. Hitler once dismissed the United States as a nation of consumers, incapable of true war. Yet it was precisely those consumers, retooled into workers, who built the machines that buried his empire. The Reich's boutique marvels could not withstand America's supermarket of destruction. And the B-24, rolling off Ford's line every 63 minutes, became the ultimate punchline in history's cruelest joke. At its core, The duel between Germany and the United States was less a clash of armies than a clash of production philosophies. Hitler insisted war was about brilliance, about a few perfect weapons changing destiny. America decided war was about boredom, about producing so many good-enough machines that the enemy drowned in them. And history, it turns out, sides with boredom. Let's put it bluntly. Germany built its war machine like a luxury boutique. Each Messerschmitt fighter was a tailored suit, each Panzer tank a handcrafted wristwatch. Elegant, impressive, but expensive and scarce. America, by contrast, built its arsenal like a department store. B-24s rolled out like cheap but sturdy boots, not beautiful, but available in every size and color, so long as the color was olive drab. Which wins in a war of attrition? 10 boutique suits or 10,000 factory-made uniforms? The numbers mock Hitler louder than any Allied propaganda. Germany produced about 1,400 Me-262 jets during the war. America produced 18,000 B-24 bombers, 13 times as many, each carrying tons of explosives. Germany poured resources into 6,000 V-2 rockets, each costing as much as a fighter plane, yet delivering payloads smaller than a single B-24 mission. America dropped millions of tons of bombs from its bombers. Do the math. Ford's assembly line humiliated Piemann's laboratory. Consider labor. The Reich enslaved prisoners, forcing them to work in underground factories at gunpoint. The U.S. employed women in daylight factories, paying them overtime. One workforce lived on starvation rations, the other ate packed lunches. Guess which side built more, faster, and better? Hitler believed cruelty was strength. In reality, it was inefficiency disguised as discipline. The German worker built under fear, the American worker built under pride. And pride runs longer shifts. Then there was fuel. Germany poured money into jets and rockets but forgot that machines need gasoline. By 1944, liberators were shredding synthetic fuel plants. The Luftwaffe had aircraft but no octane. It was like designing a Ferrari without bothering to build gas stations. America, meanwhile, not only produced bombers but also flooded the world with oil. Hitler laughed at Ford's cars. He forgot that Ford's cars had created a nation obsessed with fuel. When America weaponized that obsession, Germany's tanks ran dry. And technology. Hitler adored his wonder weapons, V-1s, V-2s, jet fighters. Each was impressive, terrifying even, but strategically impotent. A V-2 rocket cost a fortune and killed a few dozen people. A B-24 raid cost a shift at Willow Run and destroyed an entire factory complex. Germany built marvels to inspire headlines. America built machines to win wars. It's the difference between fireworks and earthquakes. One dazzles briefly, the other reshapes the ground you stand on. The true tragedy, if one can find tragedy amid satire, is that Hitler's arrogance blinded him to the obvious. Reports of American production were dismissed as exaggerations. Advisors who warned of the U.S. industrial threat were ignored. He could not imagine that a nation of refrigerators and automobiles could transform overnight into a nation of bombers and tanks. He mistook democracy's flexibility for weakness, and dictatorship's rigidity for strength. That was his gravest miscalculation. Because while the Reich built weapons in silos, America built systems. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was part of a nationwide web of suppliers, railroads, and labor pools. Cut one link, and another compensated. Germany centralized production, leaving it brittle. Bomb Piemont, and rocket production collapsed. Bomb Willow Run, and 4 other plants filled the gap. Hitler demanded control. Roosevelt encouraged redundancy. One produced fragility, the other produced resilience. Even Hitler's obsession with prestige played into his downfall. He wanted weapons that symbolized power, that could impress allies and terrify enemies. But symbols don't stop bombers. The Reich wasted time polishing prototypes while America stacked squadrons like cordwood. The Führer's speeches boomed with promises of miracles. The liberators droned with a monotony of certainty. Which mattered more in the end, a dictator's rhetoric or an assembly line schedule? So here is the cruel punchline. Hitler laughed at American industry because he thought war was theater, and theater demands spectacle. America treated war like paperwork, tedious, endless, repetitive. Fill out the forms, meet the quotas, finish the shifts. And in modern war, paperwork beats theater every time. By the time Hitler realized his mistake, it was too late. His wonder weapons dazzled no one but himself. His armies ran on empty. His skies belonged to the liberators. The Reich collapsed not because its weapons were bad, they were often excellent, but because they were too few, too late, and too fragile. The joke he made at America's expense became the joke history made at his. The fall of Hitler's Reich did not happen in a single moment. It was not one bomb, one battle, one invasion. It was a slow, grinding process, and few machines symbolized that process more than the B-24 Liberator. The endless drone of its engines marked the soundtrack of Germany's unraveling. Strategically, the Liberator campaign proved an uncomfortable truth for the Reich. Terror weapons and miracle projects mean little against relentless production. Hitler had poured faith into rockets that dazzled but did not decide the war. He underestimated the hum of an assembly line, the discipline of a time clock, the power of monotony. In the end, what broke Germany was not a single wonder weapon but the banal efficiency of Ford's bomber plant, proof that victory can be manufactured hourly. For the Allies, the lesson was transformative. The United States discovered that its greatest weapon was not any tank, ship, or plane, but its industrial system. Willow Run was a case study in how civilian industry could be retooled for military supremacy. What Hitler mocked as consumer softness turned out to be a hidden strength. A society that mass-produced comfort could just as easily mass-produce destruction. Radios became fuses, refrigerators became engines, typewriters became bomb sites. The conversion was not only rapid, it was total. And when the war ended, this lesson carried into the Cold War. America did not demobilize into weakness, it reorganized into a permanent military-industrial complex. Willow Run was only the beginning of a philosophy. Never again would the nation underestimate the power of production. Tanks, jets, missiles, nuclear submarines, all flowed from the same principle that built the B-24. Hitler's laughter, frozen in the ruins of Berlin, became a ghostly reminder of what happens when you misjudge your opponent's factories. For Germany, the consequences were humiliating. Post-war interviews with engineers revealed disbelief at America's scale. One Luftwaffe officer admitted that when he first saw photographs of Willow Run, he thought they were propaganda fakes. He simply could not imagine a factory capable of producing a heavy bomber every hour. To a society trained to prize craftsmanship, the idea of weaponry as a conveyor belt product seemed absurd. That absurdity destroyed them. The social impact in America was equally profound. The workers of Willow Run, many of them women, many of them migrants from farms or small towns, became part of a generation that proved industrial labor could win wars. Rosie the Riveter was not a slogan, it was a reality. While Germany drove slaves into tunnels, America invited mothers, daughters, and wives into daylight factories, paying them wages and respecting their contribution. It was an inversion of Hitler's worldview. Freedom, not oppression, powered the greater machine. Economically, the scale of production laid the foundation for post-war prosperity. Willow Run's workforce transitioned from bombers back to consumer goods, fueling the boom of the 1950s. Veterans returning home found a nation not exhausted, but invigorated by its wartime industry. Hitler's Reich collapsed into rubble. America emerged with factories warmed up and ready for peacetime abundance. Once again, the joke was cruel. The dictator who promised a 1,000-year Reich left only ruins, while the democracy he mocked set the stage for decades of global dominance. And then there is the cultural legacy. The Liberator itself faded after the war, overshadowed by jet bombers and nuclear weapons. But its story remained a parable. The B-24 was not beautiful, not beloved, often criticized by those who flew it. Yet it represented the victory of function over form, of scale over spectacle. Historians still debate whether strategic bombing alone could have won the war. But there is no debating that without the Liberator and its industrial brethren, D-Day might have failed, fuel might have flowed, and Hitler's laughter might have lasted longer. From a philosophical angle, the B-24 raises an ironic truth about modern conflict. Wars are no longer won on battlefields but in spreadsheets. Output per hour, tons per month, fuel barrels delivered, these are the numbers that decide destinies. Hitler dreamed of history books filled with tales of his rockets and jets. Instead, history books record how a factory clock in Michigan struck victory every 63 minutes. The satire writes itself. The Führer believed democracy was decadent because it valued abundance. But abundance is precisely what democracy weaponized. Ford's conveyor belt became America's spear. Consumer culture became military culture. Hitler's sneer at refrigerators turned into the sound of liberators overhead, dropping the industrial equivalent of a refrigerator every few seconds on his cities. In the long arc of history, the lesson endures. Nations that mock consumerism, that sneer at mass production, do so at their peril. Innovation dazzles, but industry endures. Germany's mistake was not a lack of genius but a lack of humility. They believed quality would trump quantity. They were wrong. Modern war punishes arrogance more swiftly than incompetence. By 1945, as Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the last echoes of liberators faded from German skies. But the legacy of those bombers remained. They had proven that laughter cannot stop a factory, that ideology cannot outpace an assembly line, that arrogance cannot fuel an empty tank. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. Hitler thought history would laugh with him. Instead, history laughed at him, every 63 minutes, with every B-24 that rolled off Ford's line. History is full of ironies, but few sting quite like this one. Adolf Hitler, the man who mocked America's industry as weak and decadent, was buried beneath its output. He had laughed at Ford, at factories, at the very idea of mass production as a weapon. Yet in the end, his Reich was undone not by genius prototypes or miracle rockets, but by the monotonous rhythm of assembly lines. The B-24 Liberator was no miracle weapon. It was ungainly, difficult to fly, and unloved by many of its crews. But none of that mattered. It was plentiful. And in modern war, plentiful beats perfect. One bomber every 63 minutes, Ford's factory clock ticked like a metronome of doom, drowning out the boasts of the Reich. Each new liberator was another reminder that arrogance cannot outproduce reality. The lesson is blunt, and it remains timeless. A dictatorship that worshipped spectacle will always underestimate the quiet power of efficiency. A society that values comfort may seem soft, but its ability to mobilize production is a hidden strength. The United States proved that rivets and overtime could achieve more than rockets and rhetoric. Germany's wonder weapons dazzled for moments. America's factories thundered for years. And the human story is just as sharp. In America, ordinary workers, many of them women, discovered their labor could tilt the balance of a world war. In Germany, enslaved laborers toiled in misery, producing weapons that collapsed under their own scarcity. The contrast is stark. One system turned freedom into productivity, the other turned cruelty into futility. Which one lasted longer? Which one triumphed? So what remains of Hitler's laughter? Nothing but an echo in the rubble of Berlin, a hollow memory of arrogance that underestimated the strength of a nation of consumers. The true laughter belongs to history itself, because the punchline was delivered every hour, every bomber, every mission. And as you reflect on this story, consider its relevance today. Wars are still decided by production, by logistics, by the quiet machinery of industry. Technology changes, but the lesson does not. Never laugh at your enemy's factories. Never underestimate the power of abundance. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you already know how history loves irony. And there are countless more tales where arrogance met reality, where spectacle collapsed before efficiency. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and join us for the next chapter. Because history isn't finished mocking the proud, and together we'll uncover every punchline. The B-24's wings may be silent now, but the lesson of its production still roars. Victory can be manufactured.